June 14, 2024, the day Russia spoke in a language the West refuses to hear. Let me tell you something most analysts won't. The events of June 14 weren't just another diplomatic spat or military posturing exercise. They were Russia's strongest, most unambiguous statement, yet a declaration that the post-Cold War order is dead, and the West's attempts to revive it are not just futile, but dangerous. I've spent decades studying Russian strategy, from the Soviet collapse to the present, and I can tell you Moscow has finally dropped the pretense. The question is whether Washington will listen before it's too late. The official narrative, of course, is far more sanitized. On that Friday, the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs released a statement condemning NATO's aggressive action and warning that further military support for Ukraine would be met with asymmetric responses. The White House dismissed it as typical Kremlin bluster. So why is the West so determined to believe its own propaganda? Because admitting the truth that Russia is not only surviving but thriving under pressure would force a reckoning with the failures of Western strategy. And that's something no one in Washington or Brussels wants to do. What's really the hidden motivations behind Russia's statement? Russia's June 14 statement wasn't just rhetoric. It was a calculated escalation, designed to send three clear. 1. The red lines are non-negotiable. For years, the West has treated Russia's warnings about NATO action as bluster. But Moscow has repeatedly made it Ukraine's membership in NATO as an existential threat. The June 14 statement didn't just reiterate that position, it attached a timeline. The language was further NATO involvement in Ukraine will be met with measures that are not limited to the theater of operations. In plain English, that means if NATO crosses certain thresholds, like deploying long-range missiles in Ukraine or establishing permanent bases, Russia will respond in ways that could escalate beyond Ukraine. 2. The West's economic leverage is fading. The sanctions regime was supposed to cripple Russia, but it's had the opposite effect. By forcing Moscow to pivot eastward, the West has accelerated the decline of the dollar's dominance. Russia now conducts the majority of its trade in rubles, yuan, and dirhams, and it's actively working to create a parallel financial system with China, India, and the BRICS nations. The June 14 statement included a subtle but critical: the era of Western economic hegemony is over. That wasn't just posturing, it was an acknowledgement that Russia is no longer dependent on Western markets, and that sanctions are a two-way street. 3. Russia is preparing for a long war. The most dangerous misconception in the West is that Russia is fighting a limited war in Ukraine. It's not. Moscow sees this as an existential struggle against NATO, and it's mobilizing its society, economy, and military accordingly. The June 14 statement made that this is not a conflict over territory. It is a battle for the future of the international order. That's not hyperbole, it's a recognition that Russia is in a war of attrition, and it's willing to outlast the West. But here's where it gets interesting. The statement wasn't just directed at the West, it was also a signal to Russia's own population. Putin's approval ratings have remained stubbornly high despite the war, but there are signs of fatigue. The June 14 statement was designed to rally domestic support by framing the conflict as a defensive struggle against Western aggression. It's a classic case of rallying around the flag, but in this case, the flag is real. The broader geopolitical why this matters more than Ukraine. Now, let's out. The June 14 statement wasn't just about Ukraine, it was about the future of global power dynamics. And if we don't understand that, we're missing the forest for the trees. The US and its allies still operate under the assumption that the post-Cold War unipolar order is sustainable. They believe that NATO action, economic sanctions, and military deterrence can contain Russia and China indefinitely. But that assumption is based on a fundamental misreading of history. Great powers don't accept permanent subordination, they push back. And right now, Russia and China are pushing back harder than ever. Let me put this in historical context. In 1962, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, the US and USSR came to the brink of nuclear war because the Soviets attempted to place missiles in Cuba, a direct response to American missiles in Turkey. The crisis was resolved when both sides recognized each other's red lines. Today, we're in a similar situation, but the West refuses to acknowledge it. NATO's action into Eastern Europe, the deployment of missile defense systems in Poland and Romania, and the arming of Ukraine are all seen by Moscow as direct threats to its security. And yet, the US and its allies act surprised when Russia responds. This isn't just about Ukraine, it's about the broader struggle between unipolarity and multipolarity. The US wants to maintain its global dominance, but Russia and China are building an alternative order. The BRICS alliance, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and the growing use of non-dollar trade are all part of this effort. And the June 14 statement was a clear signal that Russia is no longer willing to play by Western rules. Here's the West's response to this challenge has been disastrous. Instead of recognizing Russia's legitimate security concerns, the US has doubled down on containment, pushing NATO ever closer to Russia's borders. Instead of engaging in diplomacy, Washington has relied on economic coercion and military threats. And instead of acknowledging the limits of American power, policymakers have assumed that the US can dictate outcomes indefinitely. That's not strategy, that's hubris. The military. Why the West is playing with fire. Now, let's talk about the military dimension, because this is where things get really dangerous. The June 14 statement didn't just issue warnings, it laid out a new doctrine. Russia is no longer limiting its responses to Ukraine. If NATO crosses certain thresholds, like deploying long-range missiles in Ukraine or establishing permanent bases, Moscow has made it clear that it will respond asymmetrically. That could mean strikes on NATO supply lines, cyber attacks on critical infrastructure, or even limited nuclear demonstrations. Let me be, I'm not saying Russia wants a direct war with NATO. But I am saying that the West's current strategy is increasing the risk of escalation in ways that are reckless and unnecessary. Consider the NATO's forward deployments are provocative. The US and its allies have stationed thousands of troops in Eastern Europe, deployed missile defense systems in Poland and Romania, and conducted large-scale military exercises near Russia's borders. From Moscow's perspective, this looks like preparation for war. And in a crisis, miscalculation is inevitable. Ukraine is a proxy war, not a local conflict. The West likes to frame this as a battle for Ukrainian sovereignty, but that's a half-truth. The reality is that the US and its allies are using Ukraine as a proxy to weaken Russia. And while that might sound like a smart strategy, it ignores the fact that Russia is a nuclear power with the ability to escalate in ways that could spiral out of control. The West's military edge is eroding. For decades, the US enjoyed unchallenged military superiority. But that era is over. Russia has developed hypersonic missiles, advanced air defense systems, and electronic warfare capabilities that can neutralize Western advantages. Meanwhile, China is rapidly extending its navy and missile forces. The idea that the US can fight and win a conventional war against both Russia and China is fantasy. The nuclear threshold is lower than you think. The West assumes that Russia would never use nuclear weapons, but that's a dangerous assumption. Moscow's nuclear doctrine allows for the use of tactical nukes in response to existential threats. And if NATO crosses certain red lines, like attacking Russian territory or deploying nuclear-capable missiles in Ukraine, Russia may decide that it has no choice but to escalate. I've been warning about this for years. The hawks in Washington and Brussels act like war with Russia would be quick and easy, but they're ignoring the lessons of history. Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, these weren't just failures, they were warnings. And yet, we're repeating the same mistakes. The domestic political why Washington can't back down. Now, let's talk about the domestic politics driving this crisis, because that's where things get really ugly. The Biden administration's Russia policy isn't just about geopolitics, it's about domestic survival. The Democratic Party is facing a perfect a weak president, a divided base, and a Republican Party that's increasingly isolationist. In this environment, appearing tough on Russia is one of the few things that unites the party. And that's a problem, because it means there's no incentive to pursue diplomacy. Consider the Ukraine is a political sacred cow. For the Biden administration, Ukraine has become a symbol of American resolve. Backing down now would be seen as a sign of weakness, and in an election year, that's a non-starter. The result? A policy that's driven by political expediency rather than strategic logic. The military-industrial complex is winning. The U.S. has sent over $100 billion in military aid to Ukraine, and defense contractors are reaping the rewards. Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, and Northrop Grumman have all seen their stock prices soar. And in Washington, that means there's a powerful lobby pushing for endless war. The media is fueling the fire. the Western press has framed this conflict as a battle between democracy and autocracy, good and evil. And while that narrative might sell papers, it's also making diplomacy impossible. When every Russian proposal is dismissed as propaganda and every peace initiative is seen as appeasement, there's no room for negotiation. The Republican alternative is even worse. The GOP is split between isolationists like Trump, who want to cut off Ukraine entirely, and hawks like McConnell, who want to escalate. Neither side is offering a coherent strategy, just more polarization. The result? A policy that's stuck in neutral, with no off-ramp in sight. Scenario where this is headed. So, where does this leave us? Let me lay out the three most likely scenarios, and none of them are good. Scenario 1, the frozen conflict. In this scenario, the war in Ukraine grinds to a stalemate. Russia consolidates its gains in the east and south, while Ukraine holds the rest with Western support. The fighting continues at a low intensity, but neither side can achieve a decisive victory. The result? A frozen conflict that lasts for years, draining resources and perpetuating instability. This is the best-case scenario, but it's still a disaster because it means the war never really ends. Scenario 2, escalation and limited war. This is the most likely outcome. NATO continues to arm Ukraine, Russia responds with asymmetric measures, and the conflict escalates. We could see strikes on NATO supply lines, cyber attacks on Western infrastructure, or even limited nuclear demonstrations. The risk of miscalculation is high, and the potential for a wider war is real. This is the scenario that keeps me up at night because it's the one where things spiral out of control. Scenario 3, direct NATO-Russia war. This is the worst-case scenario, but it's not impossible. If NATO crosses Russia's red lines, like deploying long-range missiles in Ukraine or establishing permanent bases, the Kremlin may decide that it has no choice but to escalate. That could mean strikes on NATO territory, a full-scale mobilization, or even the use of tactical nukes. The result? A direct war between nuclear powers, with catastrophic consequences. Now, I want to be none of these scenarios are good. But the longer we ignore the reality of this conflict, the more likely we are to stumble into the worst one. The grand strategy why the U.S. is losing the 21st century. Let's take a step back and ask the big why is the U.S. in this mess in the first place? The answer is because we've been pursuing a grand strategy that's unsustainable, unrealistic, and ultimately self-defeating. For the past 3 decades, the U.S. has operated under the assumption that it can maintain global dominance indefinitely. We've exited NATO to Russia's borders, waged endless wars in the Middle East, and tried to contain China through economic coercion. And yet, despite all this, we're losing ground. Russia is stronger than ever, China is rising, and our allies are hedging their bets. This isn't just a failure of policy, it's a failure of strategy. The U.S. is trying to maintain a unipolar order in a multipolar world, and it's not working. The result? A series of crises that we're ill-equipped to handle. Let me put this in historical context. The British Empire collapsed because it overstretched itself, trying to maintain control over a global empire it could no longer afford. The Soviet Union collapsed because it tried to compete with the U.S. in a military and economic arms race it couldn't win. And now, the U.S. is making the same mistakes, assuming that our power is limitless, that our allies will follow us forever, and that our adversaries will accept permanent subordination. That's not how the world works. Great powers rise and fall, and the 21st century is shaping up to be a multipolar one. The question is whether the U.S. will adapt or whether we'll keep doubling down on a strategy that's doomed to fail. What we should do a realist path forward. So, what's the alternative? How do we avoid catastrophe and secure American interests in a multipolar world? Here's what we should. 1. Recognize Russia's red lines. The first step is to acknowledge that Russia has legitimate security concerns. NATO action to Ukraine is a non-starter, and we need to make that clear. That doesn't mean abandoning Ukraine, it means negotiating a settlement that respects Russia's interests while preserving Ukrainian sovereignty. 2. Pursue diplomacy, not escalation. The U.S. needs to reopen channels of communication with Moscow. That doesn't mean capitulation, it means recognizing that diplomacy is the only way to avoid war. We should be exploring confidence-building measures, arms control agreements, and economic cooperation, not doubling down on containment. 3. Rebalance our alliances. The US can't be the world's policeman forever. We need to encourage our allies to take more responsibility for their own defense, while also recognizing that some countries, like India and Turkey, are going to hedge their bets. That's not a threat, it's a reality. 4. Focus on China. The real long-term challenge isn't Russia, it's China. We need to shift our strategic focus to the Indo-Pacific, where the stakes are higher and the risks of conflict are greater. That means reducing our commitments in Europe and the Middle East, not exiting them. 5. Reform our domestic politics. The biggest obstacle to a coherent foreign policy isn't Russia or China, it's our own dysfunction. We need to break the stranglehold of the military-industrial complex, reduce polarization, and elect leaders who understand the limits of American power. Now, I know this is controversial. This is appeasement. But let me be clear, this isn't about surrendering to Russia. It's about recognizing reality. The establishment loves to throw around words like appeasement because it's easier than admitting they've been wrong for decades. But let's be honest, what we've been doing isn't working. Since the end of the Cold War, we've treated Russia like a defeated power, exiting NATO right up to its borders, bombing its allies in the Balkans, and then acting shocked when Moscow pushes back. That's not strategy, that's arrogance. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about Ukraine. It's about the fundamental shift in global power dynamics. The unipolar moment is over, and the sooner we accept that, the better. Russia isn't the Soviet Union, but it's not a pushover either. It's a nuclear-armed state with a military that's been modernized, a population that's resilient, and a leadership that's willing to take risks to protect what it sees as its core interests. And let's not forget Russia has weathered far worse than economic sanctions. Napoleon and Hitler both learned that lesson the hard way. Here's the uncomfortable: the longer this war drags on, the worse it gets for everyone. Ukraine is being bled dry, Europe is facing an energy crisis of its own making, and the US is pouring billions into a conflict that has no clear endgame. Meanwhile, China is watching, calculating, and positioning itself to be the arbiter of a new world order. If we're not careful, we'll wake up one day to find that we've exhausted ourselves in a proxy war while Beijing quietly consolidates its dominance in Asia. Let me explain why this matters for our military. The US Army and Marine Corps are already stretched thin. We've got aging equipment, recruitment shortfalls, and a force structure that's optimized for counterinsurgency, not great power competition. The last thing we need is another forever war in Europe. And yet, that's exactly what the establishment wants. They'll tell you we need to stand with Ukraine until the bitter end, but they won't tell you what that end looks like. Is it regime change in Moscow? The dismemberment of Russia? Because if that's the goal, we're talking about a conflict that could last decades, and one that could easily go nuclear. Now, I'm not saying we should abandon Ukraine. But we need to be realistic about what's achievable. The idea that we can force Russia to withdraw from Crimea or Donbass is fantasy. Those regions have been part of Russia's sphere of influence for centuries, and no amount of HIMARS or Leopard tanks is going to change that. What we can do is negotiate a settlement that freezes the conflict, preserves Ukrainian sovereignty in the rest of the country, and gives both sides a face-saving off-ramp. That's not surrender, it's statecraft. And let's talk about the military implications. The war in Ukraine has been a wake-up call for the Pentagon. We've seen the limitations of our high-tech, precision strike doctrine when faced with a peer adversary. Russia's electronic warfare, drone swarms, and massed artillery have exposed vulnerabilities in our own forces. If we're not careful, we'll find ourselves in a situation where we're fighting a war we're not prepared for, whether it's in Taiwan, the South China Sea, or even the Baltics. Here's another thing the establishment won't tell: Russia's military isn't the paper tiger we thought it was. Yes, they've taken heavy losses in Ukraine, but they've also adapted. They shifted to a more sustainable, attritional strategy, and they're grinding down Ukrainian forces with relentless artillery and drone strikes. Meanwhile, they're ramping up production of missiles, tanks, and drones at a pace that should concern us. And let's not forget, they've got the world's largest nuclear arsenal. That's not something we can ignore. So where does that leave us? It leaves us with a choice. We can continue down the path of escalation, risking a direct conflict with Russia that could spiral out of control. Or we can take a step back, reassess our priorities, and focus on the real long-term China. Because at the end of the day, that's where the future of global power is being decided. The Indo-Pacific is the new center of gravity, and if we're not careful, we'll find ourselves bogged down in Europe while Beijing rewrites the rules of the international order. Now, I know what some of you are. We need a foreign policy that's based on realism, not ideology. We need to recognize that the world has changed, and that the old playbook no longer works. That means engaging with Russia, not isolating it. It means focusing on China, not getting bogged down in endless wars. And it means having the humility to admit that we don't always know what's best for the rest of the world. Because at the end of the day, that's what this is really about. It's not about Ukraine. It's not even about Russia. It's about whether the United States is willing to adapt to a new era, or whether we'll cling to the past until it's too late. And if we don't make the right choice, history won't be kind to us.